Welcome to the webinar, How to Make 360 Feedback Reviews Successful. I'm here with my good friend and colleague, Jack Zenger. Jack, hope you're having a good day. You're on mute. So,
thank you, Joe. Nice to be with you. Thanks for the reminder. Yeah.
Oh, that's good. Don't mute yourself again, okay?
I won't. I promise.
Jack, we have given back so many 360s over the years, haven't we? And
we have.
I think this is something we have some experience with. So we're going to talk today about that. And so we have, and just to kind of give you an idea about who's on the call with us, there's Jack and myself. We also have Jennifer Lambert on the call, and Jennifer will be sharing some information at the end of the webinar. Jennifer, how are you? How are you doing?
Doing well and good, thank you.
All right, and we have Tracy Consolini. Tracy is our chat host, and she's the busiest person on the webinar because there's always so much chat, and we'd like to encourage that. Tracy, any suggestions for what people might do in the chat function?
Yes, thanks so much, Joe. As Jack said, I'll monitor the chat, the chat box, and as time permits, we'll be sharing some of your questions. So feel free to submit them. If we do not get to yours, we'll be glad to follow up with answers after the webinar. And if you need any help, again, or if you don't have a question, please enter it in the chat. I'm looking forward to speaking with everybody over the chat.
Thank you, Tracy. And just once again, oftentimes people say, what was the number one thing you talked about in the webinar? And I always kind of get muddled because I can't come up with something that I thought was number one, but you might. And as you listen to the webinar, if you have something you thought was great insight that was useful, I love to read these things because they really kind of tell me what was communicated and what you got out of it. If you share that on LinkedIn or Twitter and use the hashtag ZF webinar, we will look at those and we'll select 3 people for a $25 gift card. You know, I love it when I get gift cards because my wife always knows when I buy something using our credit card. And then she asks me, and see, this is something you can just use it and your wife or husband never knows, your partner, you know, just, so this will be fun for you. Okay, Jack, we have some polls today.
Yes, we'd like to better understand the participants we have with us today. So here's a very quick little poll. If you would please jump on and respond. In terms of your experience with 360-degree feedback. So number 1, yes, you've participated. 2, no, you haven't. And number 3 is, I can't recall. So let's just see what people, how people respond to that.
It'd be interesting to see how many mark I can't recall.
Can't recall.
Such an uneventful experience.
Can we display those results? Yes, let's see here.
Okay.
We're stuck here, are we, on the polling?
Oh, there we go.
There we go, okay.
Well, about 75% have.
75%, and only the very small numbers couldn't recall. Okay, thank you very much. We have one more poll for you, and that was about your experience, those of you who participated, and that's the great majority of you. So please, if you would, respond to these questions. Great experience, perhaps life-changing, good experience, okay, terrible. Please respond, if you would, to those.
This is a bit of a traumatic experience for a lot of people, isn't it, Jack?
You know, I think it used to be more than it is now, but it is. It can be for on occasion. So let's see. Great experience, 15%. Most people said good experience, okay. Only 7% said it was a terrible experience. Well, thank you very much for letting us know where we are with our group here today. Let's talk a little bit about what our agenda is for our session. We're going to cover 5 things, basically. We want to talk about the factors that make the 360 process a very positive one. Number 2, we want to talk about the correlation between 360-degree feedback data and a variety of other business outcomes. And Joe will be presenting to you some data specifically about some of those outcomes. We want to talk about how 360-degree feedback helps people improve and what's the underlying theory behind that. And finally, what are the hurdles that kind of get in people's way as they participate in their own development. And then right at the very end, we're going to give you some feedback about the self-assessment that you took, about your willingness to ask for and happily receive feedback from your colleagues. We think that the 360-degree feedback process is the ultimate expression of asking for feedback. And so we thought it might be helpful for you to know, how do you score on that?
Well, to give you a preview on your results, the first section looks at your experience in receiving 360 feedback. We created that section, and again, not all these factors depend on you. Some of the factors depend on the organization that you were with and whether certain features were part of it. But the scores range from a -12 to a +24, and a +24 would be a perfect 360 experience. And you'll get your score on this. And to just kind of give you an overview of these 12 factors, Jack, you wrote this article for Harvard Business Review on these different factors that really make a 360 experience successful. Can you walk through those different factors and talk about them?
You bet I will. And let me just say that we've written 2 papers on the 360-degree feedback topic. One is about the qualities that make a great instrument. We're in the process of revising that, but those of you who have registered for today's webinar, we're going to send you a copy of that. And then secondly, we've written this article that was published in Harvard about what makes the experience an exceptional experience. And so just quickly, let me review those 10 things. First of all, is having a positive attitude. It's the attitude that the individual participant kind of enters into the whole process with that makes an enormous difference. Secondly, having time to receive the feedback, time to digest it and kind of internalize it. That's an important element. The third one is some vehicle for follow-up, follow-on coaching. The fourth is that when participants share their results with their manager, we know that that makes a huge difference in the outcomes. And along with that, sharing their results with their subordinates, with their direct reports, makes a huge difference. And particularly sharing not always just all the results, but their plan for development, what they're going to do as a result of all this. We also are talking about the follow-up process. We know that 360-degree feedback works best when there's periodic, regular follow-up, 3 months, 6 months, coaching conversations, discussions with your manager, discussions with your direct reports. All those make a big difference. There's a new feature that R360 makes available, and that's what we're calling it a pulse survey. So how do you, once you've chosen some things to work on and get better at, how do you know if you're getting better? This pulse survey reaches in and selects 3 or 4 items that you're working on, and then measures only those with your participants so that you can then get a sense of how am I doing on the things I said I was going to get better about. We obviously believe that when there's clearly going to be a follow-up reassessment, a complete 360-degree feedback, usually 18 to 24 months later, sometimes a year later. But when people know that that's going to happen, they take the whole thing much more seriously. And it's a little bit, kind of, it gives you energy and enthusiasm to work on those qualities that you've identified as being opportunities for your development. It helps you monitor your overall leadership journey. That as people go through their careers working for organizations or whether they're independent, people need a career plan. And the 360 process works best when people can link it to their own leadership development journey. And finally, the 10th element has to do with having a supportive manager and meeting periodically with her or him to talk about your progress, your development, or it could be an outside coach with whom you're working who helps you in that process. So those are the 10 elements of an extraordinary 360-degree feedback process.
Jack, I was just on a call on Monday with the CEO of an organization, and they had just initiated a 360 process. And as a new organization, it's the first time they'd done it. The CEO wanted people to be transparent. And so at the end of the meeting, he took 20 minutes and he shared in great detail all of his results, everything. But I thought that was a great way to kick off a process because other people saw that. They saw how open he was with his results. I think it makes a lot of difference when you do that.
Yeah.
So let's talk about what we know about leadership effectiveness and outcomes. First of all, there's these correlations to all these outcomes. And if you ask yourself, why are we doing this thing? I mean, some people think it's just a feel-good exercise. It's about, just looking the role or playing the role. But we would say that the reason we're doing it is because better leaders equal better results. And let me show you an example of that. This graph shows you the impact of leadership effectiveness. That's a horizontal axis. And leadership effectiveness is the overall average of all the items in the 360. And then what we're looking at, the bars represent the percentage of people who are willing to go the extra mile. This is what we call discretionary effort. And to me, that is one of the great things about leadership is that if you can get more people that are willing to go the extra mile, that are willing to do more work, it has a tremendous impact on productivity and your ability to deliver on results. Now, what I like about this graph is that it does show you for every incremental improvement from 5 to 10, you can see there's 2% more people that are willing to go the extra mile. And from 15 to 20, there's a 2% increase. And all the way up to, you get 2 or 3%. And then when you get to the 85th percentile, it jumps to 5%. And then from the 90th to 95th, and again, 5%. And then from the 95th to the 100th, it jumps up 16%. What this demonstrates is that improving leadership improves results. And the other thing it demonstrates is the impact of really having great leadership in an organization. Now, here's another graph that shows you the percentage of people that think about quitting. And as you can see, the worst leaders, those at the 5th percentile, 53% of those people are thinking about quitting. And those in the top 5%, those at the 100th percentile, only 10%. And we find there's a correlation between intention to leave, which we're showing you here, and actually leaving. About 50% of the people that think about quitting actually quit. This next graph shows you the impact on sales. And this is a study we did in Mexico with 95 store managers. And what you see as leadership effectiveness increased, the percentage of sales that year went up. And that's what you'd like to see. Again, Better leaders, better results. And as you think about, well, why did that happen? What we found is the worst leaders had the most turnover and the best leaders had lower turnover. Even though those turnover numbers are pretty high, they're, having 81 is a lot worse than 68. The last graph shows you an interesting thing. And a lot of people say, well, what would it take to have great leadership in my organization? What we did is we measured leaders in the top 10% in an organization, a large organization, and we found that initially from 2004 to 2008, the organization had about 9.6%. And then 9 to 10, it had 9.8%. 11 to 12, it had 13%. And then 13 to 14, 18%. And then 19%, 21%. What this shows and really demonstrates is that if you work on and continue this leadership development effort, if you don't make this a one and done kind of effort, you can really drive the percentage of great leaders in an organization. Let me say, having 21% of your leaders being in the 90th percentile has a dramatic impact on the success of that organization.
So as Joe has pointed out, and we showed you earlier, we have data that says the 360-degree feedback data strongly correlates with virtually every business outcome that we can measure, whether that business outcome is productivity or profitability or employee commitment or customer satisfaction or innovation. There is a strong correlation with virtually all of those. And so the good news is that our experience has been that most leaders improve. Some improve a lot, others improve some. And we wanted to show you kind of a little more precise data about those levels of improvement. What you see here is that we've broken them into two basic groups. One is the leaders who have serious defects, derailers. We've called them fatal flaws. The first bar is the pre-test and the second bar is a post-test. Those were done roughly 18 to 24 months apart. What you see is that group that started out with fatal flaws went from the 18th percent on average to the 46th percent on average. That's a 28% gain. Compare those to the people who were working on their strengths, who didn't have any serious defects in their leadership repertoire. They went from the 55th percentile to the 75th percentile. That's a 20% gain. Not quite as much as the others, but obviously the first group is starting from a much lower base. So the conclusion we hope that you can see is that people with flaws can overcome them. People who don't have any serious flaws, but elect to work on their strengths, which is, as most of you know on this call, is what we strongly advocate. They too make significant gains. Now, what's the impact of that change in those leaders on the employee engagement of the people who report to them? As many of you know, and we're going to talk about, we have some items in our 360 that measure employee engagement. So you see that, again, that first group, their employees went from the 34th to the 50th percentile, a 16 percentile gain. The people reporting to the managers who were working on their strengths went from, as you can see, the 52nd percentile to the 62nd percentile. Over an 18 to 24 month period, an improvement of 10%. We love the idea that we're hearing more and more executives kind of talk about, and that is, hey, we can all get better. And some executives have gone so far as to say, we want you to get 15% better every year. That's a pretty lofty target. but it's clear that people can get better when they take their feedback seriously and work on those things that they've identified.
You know, like any map or direction we had, in order to get better, in order to get to our destination, you need to know where you're going, right? And what the path is. And that 360 gives you the path. Well, let's talk about the recommended process for selecting raters. And what we want to emphasize here is the value of having leaders or raters that have different perspectives. Now, that manager perspective is interesting because it gives you a sense of, you know, how that person above you sees you and how you fit in with others. The peers, on the other hand, react in a different way. They're at the same level with you. And sometimes they can be quite critical. Sometimes they can be very supportive. The direct reports are an interesting group because they probably know you the best. Their ratings are probably most accurate. And then the others can be a variety of different people. Let me show you what we found when we looked at 1.6 million raters and looked at how positive or negative they were. It looks like the most critical group was the people themselves. That's not unusual. But then what we found is the direct reports as a group tended to be more positive. The peers were slightly less positive than the manager. Now, that'll vary a lot. We find that a lot of people, when they get their feedback from their peers tend to be the most negative group, and other times they tend to be positive. And sometimes direct reports can be a real critical group. It varies a lot. As you think about who's going to rate you, take some time to try and get those different perspectives. Use those rater groups to your advantage. That other group can be interesting. For instance, some people use the other group as other peers that don't work at the same location. But then other people use the other group as the second level direct reports, the direct reports of your direct reports. So think about who you want feedback from and get that diversity of opinion. When selecting raters, you should be given we believe it's the best practice for people to choose their respondents. Now, a lot of times people worry that you're stuffing the ballot box here. The people will manipulate the findings. It's interesting because I've found some people that tried to do that only to find out that the people they thought would be, you know, kind of nice to them weren't. Because when they got the chance to give them some tough feedback, they did. Choose those you believe will give you honest feedback. Select a diverse set of respondents and involve both advocates and critics. I was with an individual once, he showed me his report. It was very negative. I said, who'd you ask to give you feedback? And he says, everybody that hated me. I said, well, you're a good judge. I mean, you ought to get your critics, but get your advocates too, and that's a good mix. We'd recommend around asking 15 people to give you feedback. Our average over 100,000 leaders is about 13. And by the way, if you ask 15, you end up getting 13. And it depends on how well you know people and how many people you interact with. You ought to ask people that can give you good feedback who've known you. And then ask your manager for suggestions on people that might be helpful. Jack?
Yeah, we think the important element here is that the people that you're asking to respond, that they understand that this is being done with you and with your support, and that you're all in. And it's not being done to you, it's being done for you. And so if you can inform them of that, we believe that really helps a lot. Secondly, we believe that it's very helpful for them to hear from you that you really are requesting their candor, you know, their honesty, that's going to be the most valuable information. And finally, that you reassure them that this whole process has confidentiality anonymity, that only the manager's responses are known to you in terms of who specifically that is, but everybody else's feedback for you is anonymous and confidential. We want to just take a minute and talk about the various ways that people can receive their feedback and the various contexts in which it happens. Many organizations are sending data to the respondents to their home in advance of any kind of get together or any kind of a session. And people get a chance to kind of get their data and mull it over and have a chance to kind of go through a process of analyzing it. And we think doing it on your own is just fine. We see a lot of times where people are in a group, and it's a group of strangers, people that they don't know, they don't work with. And there's something about a stranger that often makes people feel very free to talk about the results that they get. And so it's a little bit like the airplane passenger that's next to you that you tell your life story to, knowing you'll never see them ever again. There's something valuable about that. A third approach is where people who are colleagues get together. They're all from the same company. They know each other. They work with each other. There's something very valuable about receiving your data and having a chance to discuss it with people who are your colleagues, because they have some first-handed knowledge of you and your behavior. There's also an approach where you take an intact work team, and they can be going through a more traditional 360-degree feedback process. And we certainly have done that a lot with people. And there's something wonderful about that, where they get a chance to sort of talk with each other. We've seen pretty senior executives kind of lay their report down on the table and say, here, let me show you my results. And they're very open. And what an enormous impact that has on the culture of this team. And so we've seen some really wonderful results with that intact work team approach. And Joe's going to just in a moment talk with you about, we also have an aggregate report for the team that shows them how their results look in an aggregate kind of way. So they can see, oh, there's some people in my group who really are strong on something that I'm not very strong in, and vice versa. And finally, you can receive your feedback from a coach. And many organizations are experimenting with having a very kind of experienced coach sit down with people one-on-one and review their feedback and help them to devise a very robust personal plan of development.
Thanks, Jack. And you talked about this idea of an intact team receiving a report. This particular report, I sat down with a group, and before I showed them the results here, I said, so tell me, what kind of a team is this? Are you one of the best groups in the company? Are you okay? Or you're struggling? And they all said, we're one of the best groups in the company. By the way, I always ask that question, always get the same answer. Everybody feels like they're above average, right? And so as I showed them the report, and just think of the value of knowing the effectiveness of your team as leaders. Now, most people guess they're doing great. But as I sat down with this team, I showed them that first slide, and you can see it's in red there, but they were at the 45th percentile. I got a bunch of groans at the table because they said, oh my gosh, we're not as good as we thought we were. That's a valuable piece of information. I mean, we let people know what their productivity is, what their outcomes are. We give them all this data. Isn't this just as important to know the level of leadership effectiveness in your team? And the next slide shows you the employee commitment of all the direct reports. And then we did a study where we looked at just the people in this group, those that were below average and above average. and found that they conformed to this idea that the better the leader, the better the results, because the engagement was much higher for those above average. We showed the different competencies, which ones were people doing well on and which ones were, as a group, we did not so well. And then the importance rankings, and then the integration of the importance and the effectiveness. This can be a really valuable learning experience for a team. It can point out some common issues and some strengths that we have that you can build on. This can be a really positive experience for a group. Now, one of the things that I think is useful is that I think people need some insights. One of the things that I've found is that I gave back feedback for 25 years. People's natural inclination is to look at a feedback report and focus on what's wrong with them. And what we've found is helpful is to give people guidance about 360 feedback and some insights. The first insight that we like to share with people is there's a difference between being a good leader and a great leader. And the organizations don't want good leaders, they want great leaders. And understanding that is important. The second thing is this idea that you don't need to be perfect. And the graph on the right really represents that insight because it shows you the impact of strengths. And what we found when we first looked at this data, and this is one of the initial things Jack and I discovered, was that if people were just good at 3 skills, 3 competencies, their average effectiveness was above the 80th percentile, the 81st percentile. Most people believe that in order to be in the top 20% of leaders, they'd have to be really pretty good at everything. But this demonstrates that having 3 skills that you're really good at the 90th percentile really has and makes a significant difference. And that's our concept of strength building. Another thing that's critical is people understand the impact of perceptions. And we know that 70% of the leaders that come into our development process, they're better off focusing on strengths, but 30% have something we'd call a fatal flaw or a potential fatal flaw. For those people, they need to understand they've got a fix-it item. They need to get this out of the way. That perception creates a negative halo on them, and it's really hurting their effectiveness. And Jack showed you what can happen when people improve that fatal flaw. They move up significantly. The next thing we talk about is a way to select an issue to work on. And our model is called the CPO model. We look at 3 things: competence, passion, and organization needs. We have a process that helps people develop and understand one issue that will help them to be a great leader. And then last, we talk about this issue of nonlinear development, this insight. And one of the real tragedies of 360 feedback is people get feedback on an issue and they throw up their hands and say, well, how do I fix this? How do I get better? We have a new technique that really, and we're going to talk a little bit more about this later.
So we promised at the beginning of our webinar that we would talk about why is it that 360-degree feedback works. And we believe that one element is the fact that people have an expanded self-awareness. We want to introduce you to the work of a man named Daniel Kahneman. If you have not read his book called Thinking Fast and Slow, we recommend it highly to you. One of the things that Kahneman talks about is, how people have 2 systems of thinking. One is, and he calls it system 1. This is the thinking that is based largely on people's intuition, their subconscious mind, their prior experience. They see something, they make an instantaneous judgment about it. And Kahneman says most of us spend about 3/4 of our life in that kind of thinking, and appropriately so. I mean, it helps us get through life with relative ease. A second kind of thinking is system 2 thinking that's much more linear, much more deliberate, and slower. So I wanted to show you this little exercise that's been around for a very, very long time, and just ask you to kind of quickly kind of respond and think about which of those two lines is the longer. And we won't take the time to kind of do a little poll on this, but about 90% of people who see this look at the top line and they say, oh, the top line is shorter than the bottom line. And that's a wonderful example of system one thinking. It's instantaneous, it's quick, it's based on past experience. It just looks like the top line is shorter. But in reality, if you take a pencil or a ruler out and you draw a line between the two, you are suddenly confronted with the fact that the two lines are exactly the same length. That's when you think a little bit slower. We would submit to you that the 360-degree feedback process helps people as it pertains to their own self-awareness to not rely solely on system one thinking, but to really move toward system two thinking, where you slow down, you get some information, you get some data, and you are able to look at that objective data and see yourself in a somewhat new light.
That's really true, Jack. And one of the benefits is the reiteration and emphasis on important messages we've heard before. A lot of times when people get some negative feedback, most of the time they say, I've heard that before.
Yeah, my wife is, or my spouse or my partner or whatever has said that to me before, but I just didn't take it all that seriously. Yeah.
Yeah, that's one of the reasons we use this terminology. We said fatal flaw. It's like, I've heard that before. And yeah, and people hate it. But this idea that things that are more familiar seem more true. And the fact that you've heard it before, but you haven't done anything about it, this is one of the reasons why 360 is so helpful. So we tend to believe messages that are repeated. And getting that repeated message that this is really an issue, that you need to do something about it. I remember working on a study where I looked at 80 people from a large organization who were fired. and their average tenure was 17 years. And what was fascinating is that they'd heard the message before, they just didn't take it seriously. So the
benefits of 360-degree feedback, we believe, really come from two elements. One is that it is the nature of the information being provided. It's one quality that it has is that it can be disconfirming. That is, it's not exactly how you've currently seen yourself. When leaders find out that their perceptions of themselves aren't the same as the perceptions of others, they are faced with this very important choice. Either I change the way I think about myself, or I change how I behave. And in many cases, people say, oh, I would prefer to change how I behave. I don't want other people who interact with me to think I'm rude, or that I don't listen, or that I don't respect them as colleagues. I will prefer to change my behavior rather than go on having them think that about me. And I think the second element of 360-degree feedback is it occurs in a context. When you're going through this experience with a group of your colleagues or a group of strangers, there's something about being involved in a social context that makes this a much more comfortable, palatable process. Now, many organizations are experimenting with the use of coaches, and we're seeing great results from that. But the nature of the social context that surrounds all this, we think, is an important element of the 360 extraordinary process.
So, Jack, what are the biggest hurdles that get in the way? Well, one of those is the belief that change is not possible. We call that, and this idea that you're fixed, that, people think, they're fixed at 6, that they can't change. And we know that's not true. Second thing is the lack of desire, willingness to change, that people don't have that energy or they're not willing to take that risk. The third thing is that you want to change, but you don't know how to change. And that can negatively impact your desire to change. That if I don't know what to do, and let me give you an example of that. If you think about a skill like technical professional expertise, and if this skill was a fatal flaw, and most people, if you ask them, well, what would you do if you got low ratings, low scores on technical expertise? How would you improve? And they come up with things like, well, take classes or courses, or read books or journals, or get some stretch assignments. Now, those things can help a person who's got poor skills become pretty good, okay at technical expertise. But let's imagine that you not getting poor skills, that you're okay, you're pretty good at technical professional acumen, but you want to develop a strength. And using this linear logic, you take it to another extreme and you say, well, take more classes. Problem? I've taken all the classes. Read more books and journals. Already read them. Stretch assignments. Well, they were stretch assignments when I didn't know what I was doing, but now I'm competent. Now I know what I'm doing. They're not stretch assignments anymore. This linear process runs out of gas. And we think that's the biggest and most significant reason why a lot of 360 processes don't work, is they run out of gas. They don't have any way to help leaders develop strengths. And to do that, they need additional insights that will empower them and help them to change. Now, most 360 processes rely exclusively on linear approaches. And the linear approaches can help leaders get halfway there. They can improve performance from bad to good. But the most challenging journey is moving from good to extraordinary. And it's interesting, we found this fun article by Kelly and Kaplan. This is probably 20 years old, isn't it, Jack, this article?
At least.
And they did a fascinating study at Bell Labs. And what they did is they identified the star performers. Now, Bell Labs is full of brilliant people, right? They had more Nobel Prize winners at that point, and this is about 20 years ago. But they identified the most productive, successful scientists at Bell Labs. And, and they said, well, what characterized the best scientists? And of course, the first thought was, they must be smarter. Guess what? Everybody at Bell Labs was smart. You couldn't tell any difference in terms of intelligence or anything like that. But when they started to look at what really made a difference, it was interesting, because one of the characteristics of the people that were the best was they were good networkers. I mean, a lot of times when you think about brilliant scientists, you think about this person that sits in the corner, that never talks to anybody, that's in their lab by themselves. And they said, gee, that's not the best scientists. The best scientists actually have friends. They have colleagues. And what we found is that when we did the research, when we looked at thousands of leaders and we said, what skills help you to go from good to great? We found what we called these companion behaviors. And these are ways of improving. And without this research, you're sort of stuck with reading more journals or doing things like that. But with this research, you can see that the people that were most effective at technical expertise solved problems, and they had strong relationships, they communicated well, they pursued excellence, and they took initiative and developed others. And as we studied this through the years, I want to show you the effect of using this non-linear approach. When we just look at this one competency, and this backs up to some of this research Jack showed you on the pre-test and the post-test. In the pre-test data on the average group of leaders, they start off at the 46th percentile, and 18 to 24 months later, this group ended up at the 85th percentile. So they made a significant change. And then the next question is, well, how did they do that? How did they go from good, that was just 4 points below average, to great? And the answer is, well, they used these companion behaviors. This looks at that data and it analyzes those 8 companion behaviors. You can see the top bar there, the green and the red bars represent the technical professional acumen competency score. And then those other scores are the results on those 10 behaviors. Notice a significant change in all of the behaviors. Now, aggregate, it's in all the behaviors, but individually, people would choose 1, 2, or 3 of those behaviors to work on. But over 500 people, you get the effect across the whole group. What this effectively demonstrates is that when you move these companion behaviors, you move the competency. Jack, would you add anything to that?
You know, I would. So it happens that years ago, I used to do consulting with Bell Labs, and it was more than 20 years ago, Joe. It was probably 40 years ago. But anyway, it's really striking to see. My experience was that the most respected scientists at Bell Labs were those who didn't necessarily have the highest IQ points or that came from the most prestigious schools. They were good communicators. They were very good at building relationships. They were really good at taking initiative. In fact, the article that you cite really talks about how the fact that the most sought after, the most respected scientists at Bell Labs were those who reached out to help their colleagues, and they truly took initiative.
That's true. And so one of the things that we believe is that if you want a really effective 360 program, you've got to have this nonlinear development as part of it. It really is the juice that gives you the squeeze. So here's what we found in the self-assessment. We assessed these 2 different qualities. And the first one in section 2 was this openness to feedback. And this is a scale that goes from -5 to +5. And it really tells you how open you are to receiving, and oftentimes feedback can be negative. So are you open to that? Are you afraid of that? Or do you resist it? And the higher that score is what we found is we looked at 1,532 or 23 cases on this. There was a 0.207 correlation between your score on section 2 here and the score on section 3 as rated by others. Okay. So, when people were more open to feedback, they were more open. And in the last section there, we measured your effectiveness at asking for people for feedback. Are you comfortable doing that? And again, 360 feedback is the most open way you can ask for feedback. But just you having that habit of asking for feedback really makes a difference. Now, I want you to look at your score on this effectiveness on asking for feedback, because what we did is we correlated self scores on asking for feedback with overall leadership effectiveness. So you can see back here, this score is 3.5. You can actually plot your score on the extent to which you like to ask for feedback, and it tells you at least a projection of what your overall leadership effectiveness might be. What we found is the more open you are to asking others for feedback, the more effective you are as a leader. There's a really strong correlation there. All right. Well, Jennifer, what can you tell us about where we go from here?
Thank you so much, Joe. We appreciate everyone joining our journey with Jack and Joe today, this afternoon, as we shared our proven approach to leadership development through the importance of defining, measuring, developing, and sustaining extraordinary leaders within your organization. We're excited to partner with you on your leadership initiatives and have a special promotional offer. For more information on this offer, please respond to the question in our exit survey at the end of the webinar, or email us at info@zfco.com, and one of our representatives will be happy to reach out. Before we move to the promised Q&A that Tracy was talking about at the beginning, we'd love your feedback. We believe it's really important. We invite you to complete our exit survey that will launch and pop up in a window at the end of the webinar. Or you can go to your browser and type in bit.ly/ZF-March. This link will also be shared in the chat comments, so go and check that out as well. As an additional gift, you'll receive access to our HBR article, as well as our latest paper that Jack mentioned earlier on the critical and important components of a successful 360 instrument. Now, I'll turn the time over back to Tracy Consolini, who's been monitoring our chat to guide us through the live Q&A.
Thanks so much, Jennifer and Jack and Joe, and thanks to everyone for your participation and for keeping me very busy. The first question that I have is actually for Jack. And Jack, can you share your thoughts about using 360s or multi-rater assessments with younger, less tenured employees?
You bet. You know, I think one of the frequent messages we get from people who are very senior leadership development executives, when I've said to them, what would you do differently if you were doing this all over again? Their answer is most frequently, we would begin much earlier in people's careers. This is the kind of information that people need to have at the very beginning. It would greatly shape their success. It would. They are very receptive to feedback at this point in their life, and so we just think it's an absolutely wonderful tool for people early in their leadership journey.
Great, thanks, Jack. Jennifer, how about one for you? How do you best prepare the organization and its leaders for a successful 360 process?
Oh, that's a great question. We love to partner with and help our clients prepare the organization through a combination of different actions. And the core of that is communication, right? Communication is key to ensure that this goes well. We like to communicate about the purpose and the desired outcomes of the initiative. Also, communication about the confidentiality and anonymity, which was brought up in the chat quite a few times. We accomplish this through a strategized series of emails, email templates to share within the organization, web conferences, kickoff meetings, and status follow-up updates and reports.
Great, thanks, Jennifer. Joe, here's one for you. How do you identify and address fatal flaws and their impact on employee engagement during COVID? This kind of points to one that we've talked about in the past, about 360s used during COVID overall. So help us understand a little bit about that.
One of the interesting things about fatal flaws is people sometimes say, gee, you know, is it hard receiving that feedback? And as I'm talking to groups, I've often said, okay, your manager has some tough feedback for you. How many want to hear it? Everybody says yes. I mean, if there's a problem, most people, 99% of the people want to hear it. And so I think the value of this is just, you know, giving that data to people. Jack showed you the data. the data that the group of people with fatal flaws went from the 18th to the 44th percentile. Now, they didn't turn that fatal flaw into a profound strength. They probably went from having a fatal flaw to something that they weren't great at, but they were okay at. It wasn't getting in their way. And we found that actually the percentage of people that can fix a fatal flaw is like 60%. So the probability that you can fix this and you can move forward in your career is very high. In the pandemic, it's been very helpful to help people understand, where they were missing the boat. Things changed in the pandemic, and one of the things that we found was people needed to pay more attention when you think about this balance between getting results and how are you doing, interpersonal and personal care for people. It needed to switch from 60% focus on results, 40% people. In the pandemic, we needed to go to 60% focus on people, 40% results. And it wasn't hard to do that. People just needed the insight. And once they got it, we saw some significant change. Well, thanks, Tracy. Well, thanks for joining us today. I've enjoyed this. Jack, thanks for all your insights. And if you have questions or observations, we would love to see those posts on LinkedIn. And remember, that $25, you can buy chocolate. All right. Thanks so much.